As we think about our theme of home for Christmas, this week we've been really thinking about the promise of home. And the next two readings in the next couple of days, I think, stir up that theme even more. Today we're reading from Ezekiel chapter 37. It's a really famous chapter because it has the story of the dry bones being brought to life. And that's an image of God's people being brought to life after the destruction of exile. But we're not reading the start of chapter 37 and that story of the dry bones. We're reading at the end where God promises that he will come and he will make home with his people. He will dwell with his people. They're such beautiful, poetic, hopeful verses that God will come and be with us. And they make us think of Jesus coming to us at Christmas. They make us think of Jesus coming to our hearts. They make us think of Jesus coming again, ultimately. But I think there's a question in these readings today. When we think about the context of Ezekiel, the question is, what or where are you making home? Ezekiel, through his family line, through his birth, his upbringing, through his training, through his education, everything in his life pointed towards this one thing, that he was a priest who would serve in the temple of the Lord. And yet, in his mid-20s, he is dragged away to Babylon. And a few years later, hears of the destruction of the temple that he has prophesied, that God has given him a vision of and words pointing towards. He's a priest without a temple. He's been dislocated and destroyed. And the temple wasn't just a place for God's people to gather. We sometimes emphasize in church, the church is not the building, it's the people. But that isn't quite how Ezekiel and how the people of God understood the temple. They saw the tabernacle and then the temple as a place where God's presence, his tangible presence, his glory came and could be experienced. It was God's home on earth, a place where he came and could be known and seen and experienced by his people. But far from God's presence being in the tabernacle, being in the temple, God was speaking to Ezekiel about where his presence was in this trial. That because of the idolatry, the injustice, the turning away, the lack of acknowledging the presence of God amongst them, God had somehow removed himself from his temple. Ezekiel shares prophecies and words of hope that God will come. His presence will be amongst his people once again. He will draw his people together. Even when his people are nothing but dusty bones scattered across a desert, he will bring life and hope once again. He will resurrect them. What do you hope for? What is the home that you are mourning? I've been reflecting this last couple of weeks on how my parents have moved out of the home that they lived in for years. Lots of my friends have moved away. Lots of the people who were in my home church have moved on. And there's times when I go back up north to where I grew up and it feels like home has gone. The home that I grew up in isn't there anymore. I mean, literally my primary school has been turned into something else. It isn't there anymore. And there's a loss and a disconnection in that. But the truth that God is revealing to his people through the pain of exile is that actually he would live and dwell in and with and through his people. And ultimately that will come through giving them new hearts. And ultimately that will come through coming in the person of Jesus. And there's something richer there. That actually God would say, when my presence was in the temple, you didn't acknowledge my presence amongst you, and you carried on in your ways of idolatry and injustice. But I am preparing you for a time when I will dwell in you through my Spirit. My dislocation at not necessarily having a home to come back to has been replaced this week as I've read through some of the old newsletters of our church from the 50s and 60s and realised that my home is in what God is doing, God's mission, God's story. And in this season, which I hope lasts many, many more years, my taking part in God's story means me finding home in what God has been doing and growing here. And that is the promise of home. Not a return to a past that doesn't exist anymore, but a future, a hope where God reveals himself in a new, deeper, richer way that brings life and hope. As you read this passage today, I wonder if you could think about where you are looking back, where you remember home to be, and dare to pray and ask God where home will be in the future, where he's leading you to, where he wants to reveal himself in a new way this season.